Hi, my name is Alexandra, and I'm a bibliophile. Welcome back to another episode of A Lovely Jaunt. In today's episode, we're going to continue our discussion of A Handmaid's Tale, and also you may have noticed I've gotten a fresh haircut. This was inspired by all of my clogged drains in my house. So, for episode 3, we're going to be talking about power, sexuality, and boredom. And I made a warning on all of my other previous videos, and since I'm specifically addressing the way sexuality is dealt with in this novel, I'm going to talk about it again here. If you're a young reader, these are, adult issues that we're talking about with sexuality, so judge for yourself, maybe tell your parents, and decide if this is appropriate content for you. In the previous episode, I talked about a summary and context for the book, and that's really the only one that you need to watch before watching this one. If you want to go back and watch episode 2, we talk about theocracies and utopias, dystopias, kind of get into the purposes of those novels and the form, and it's one of my favorite episodes. I really like it, so check it out. Alright, so to begin with, let's talk about power and sexuality. What is perhaps most poignant to our current culture is the commander's complete lack of understanding of the way his power affects and supports his ability to get what he wants sexually. While he's aware that society has structured him to have access to a handmaid as well as a wife, basically Offred becomes this pregnancy vessel, this auxiliary sex machine, he's entirely unaware of how his power forces her to engage with him at the club and hide her own feelings about that situation as well. And this is really what's most poignant to our current society, because that same power differential and that pretense of wanting sex is still, I believe, in place between men and women today. She can only agree to what he wants and pretend to want the same thing. And that pretense of wanting the same thing is really where the issue is. Because, of course, he can't know that she's pretending, but she can't do anything other than pretend because he's so much more overwhelmingly powerful than she is. There's also, in dealing with this issue of sexuality, a certain sanitization from the distance that we have from the sexuality. So when we're introduced to this new society, Gilead, we become increasingly horrified. We hear of Offred's narrative about the hangings, we hear about her duties to go shopping, we understand her perception within this society, which is basically slut-shaming. We hear about the combination of her lack of power and also supreme responsibility. She's held up as this sort of fertility goddess on the one hand, but is completely powerless to actually make her pregnancy happen. And it's a cringeworthy position without the intersection of sex in the middle of that anyway. And then you layer upon that strange sex role that she has, and it becomes even worse. And then we also hear about her indoctrination by the nuns in her training facility, and all of this sort of builds horror for us as we encounter this society and learn more and more the deeper we are drawn into the narrative. And it's not merely that Offred throws off the stifling rules of society by being with Nick repeatedly. This idea of the expression of her own sexuality as she desires to express it crops up variously in her stream of conscious narrative, and it's not even that she wants Nick himself. And all of this reaches its climax when we realize that Offred has been found out, betrayed, set up, and is about to be, either a state-sanctioned murder victim or, exiled to the colonies. We're not sure which is, her fate. Then we're swept forward into a new time, far further into the future from the setting of the bulk of the novel. We realize the Handmaid's Tale has been recovered, and it is being analyzed by a professor. We hear his lecture, we learn she has escaped, and we're relieved. But something else happens too. Both the distance and the academic language serves to relieve the horror that built through the novel. But there's a feeling of resolve, but I think it's a bit of a trick. Offred may have escaped, but the society remained, and seemingly for a few hundred years beyond her. We know that in her escape, she has a daughter who was taken away from her early in the novel, and who is being indoctrinated in this same society. So that's not resolved. We know that her daughter represents all of the other women who had to continue to suffer in this position for, a couple of centuries before the society fell. So even in the lecture, the professor states that we're not supposed to judge, that we're there to learn from the society, not judge the society. Offred is saved. Society maybe has returned to something more free, but as a reader, I'm not really satisfied. And I think that's on purpose. I think Margaret Atwood is making a statement there. You kind of get to the end of the novel and you realize that things have resolved for Offred in particular, but you still want someone to stand up and say, like, no, this is wrong, and give like an inspiring speech. The Handmaid's Tale is not an advocate of amorality. It has a strong moral position. Oppressing women through power is wrong. Oppressing female sexuality is wrong. Using them for instrumental purposes is wrong. But no voice in the novel steps up and says this. You interpret it through the events of the novel, but there's no one character who's sort of standing up for this justice that needs to be stood up for. And it leaves the resolution of the novel with sort of a threat lingering, because learning from the situation is probably not sufficient. Alright, so let's take a look at Offred's boredom. Another aspect of this narrative is her boredom. This characterizes her stream of conscious narrative. It justifies the poetical style, which in other books I have found to be, pretentious if it's used sort of too heavy-handed. And in fact, the writing style very much reminds me of Sylvia Plath's poetry. And I want to share some quotes because I think they're so very lovely. And, read with an understanding of poetry, you can really get a sense of how beautiful this narrative is. Okay. So this is in section 2, chapter 2, and actually I just recently watched the first episode of The Handmaid's Tale show on Hulu, and they start off with this passage as well, and it's because it's so beautiful. So this is chapter 2, and it's the first chapter in section 2. I'm going to read to you, which means that you're probably going to look at me looking down at a page. It's going to be super exciting. A chair, a table, a lamp. Above, on a white ceiling, a relief ornament in the shape of a wreath, and in the center of it a blank space, plastered over, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out. There must have been a chandelier once. They removed anything that you could tie a rope to. A window, 2 white curtains. Under the window, a window seat with a little cushion, and when the window is partly open, it only opens partly. The air can come in and make the curtains move. I can sit in the chair or on the window seat, hands folded, and watch this. Sunlight comes in through the window too and falls on the floor, which is made of wood in narrow strips, highly polished. I can smell the polish. There's a rug on the floor, oval, of braided rags. This is the kind of touch they like, folk art, archaic, made by women in their spare time, from things that have no further use. A return to traditional values. Waste not, want not. I am not being wasted. Why do I want? On the wall above the chair, a picture framed but with no glass. A print of flowers. Blue irises, watercolor. Flowers are still allowed. Does each of us have the same print? The same chair? The same white curtains, I wonder? Government issue? So I really love this passage because, as I've mentioned, it's very poetical, very lyrical, and it's the stream of conscious narrative that we see Offred having throughout the novel. A couple of interesting points. Obviously, we have the explanation of the way in which they're trying to control these women to such an extent that they want to commit suicide, which means that they have to control their access to things that can allow them to commit suicide, whether by hanging or whether glass from the picture that they could, smash and then cut themselves open and bleed to death. So this is a very extreme situation, and Offred is aware of all of that. The other thing that I find particularly revealing of her boredom is the sentence that says, I can sit in the chair or on the window seat, hands folded, and watch this being the curtains moving. So she's literally spending hours in her bedroom, sitting, watching curtains move, if it's windy. And if she doesn't have that, she doesn't have much else in the form of entertainment. So this extreme isolation, this extreme boredom, these empty hours, you get the sense of her just sitting around and waiting for her to, fulfill her purpose in the society, and there's nothing else for her to do. All right, I have a second quote that I want to share with you guys that I think is also just stunning and beautiful, so let's go ahead and hop over there. Here she's giving a brief description of some of the flowers that she sees from the garden that Serena Joy tends. So here's a quote from that. It's much shorter. This is in chapter 5, I believe. The tulips along the border are redder than ever, opening, no longer wine cups but chalices, thrusting themselves up. To what end? They are, after all, empty. When they are old, they turn themselves inside out, then explode slowly, the petals thrown out like shards. So again, this is just beautiful poetical language, and highly metaphorical. We get the sense that this red perhaps correlates to a woman's flow. We have the sense of them being thrusting themselves up, but to what end? So again, so this sort of sexual language, and they're empty vessels, much like Offred herself, not pregnant, not full of child. And when they're empty, they turn themselves out and then explode slowly. So again, the sense of without being an empty vessel means purposelessness. She might as well kill herself. She might as well cease to exist and throw herself out like shards, which actually, interestingly enough, correlates to that language of the glass on the pictures that we saw in the previous passage that I read, this, association with suicide as a result of her purposelessness. So, one, I wanted to read those quotes to you and take a closer look at some of the metaphorical language in them, simply because they're beautiful, lyrically written, and meaningful. But also, I want to correlate them to this idea of Offred's boredom. So let's take a look at some more and continue with this idea. So, the stylistic choice and the boredom it underscores is more meaningful than merely supporting pretty turns of phrase. We have to ask the question, why is Offred bored? It's because her whole complex humanity is distilled down into one aspect. For me, this is sort of the kernel of the problematic view of sexuality that this book is sort of exposing, right? So overemphasizing sexuality kind of takes two forms, but they have the same effect. One is to sensationalize it, and this is exemplified by the club, which is obviously underground and lurid, and you can do whatever you want there, and people are in grotesque and very skimpy outfits, and it's supposed to just be completely sexuality at its most sensualized and idealized form. You make it the main motivator for everything. You glorify it. You put it everywhere, even when it doesn't make sense. When eating a burger becomes sexualized, ground up meat from a cow with like ketchup, and you spill it on your top, like in America, you know that you're in the first category if it's sort of the essence of all of advertising. The second category is to make it a tantalizing secret. No one talks about it. It's so special, it's taboo. And obviously, this puritanical society of Gilead falls more into the second category on its surface, at least, where you just, it becomes of utmost importance, but absolutely secret. And actually, if you haven't read the essay by Freud called The Unheimlich, or The Uncanny, I would totally suggest reading that. It's a little bit weird and also deals with issues of sexuality, but it really touches on this idea of how the most familiar things and most unfamiliar things become kind of conflated and cross over, and the issue of sexuality and how it's dealt with here definitely falls into that, because it's really both at once, which is why they have outlets for both at once in this society. The reality is that sexuality is one of several aspects to human nature, right? So to make it so glorified or so rare is to put it out of balance with the rest of everything that makes us human, whether physical, moral, spiritual, social. There's a complexity to our ontology that requires a broader self-expression. To distill ourselves down to our sexual identity is to, ignore everything else about the complexity of human nature. And this is why Offred is bored. She's reduced from a full human being, a mother, a friend, a sister, a lover, all of these things, down to just a sex object, a sexual vessel. She has no property, she has no agency, she has no purpose beyond, procreation. So we see her focusing in on these small, tiny details. It's almost like a camera lens is zooming in on that red flower that's, she has her head turned down. She often, the view of the description that we get reveals how much she can only look at the ground. I don't know if you've noticed that throughout the novel, but she has this view that is very tunneled, and then she can only zoom in on these things and create metaphorical meaning for herself because she can do nothing else. She lives in her head. She doesn't have conversation. She doesn't have friends. So that is why the narrative is so lyrical, zoomed in, downward focused. And it's almost like she's squeezing as much out of these few experiences of going shopping as she can, of those few moments outside of her bedroom. It's also why she spends so much time recounting and thinking about the past, not only because obviously it's meaningful to her and she misses her family and the ones that she loved, but so much of her essential self is cut off from expression and experience, so she can either descend into imagination or into the past. She doesn't have anything in the present to consume her thoughts or her being. All right, so that wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about for The Handmaid's Tale for today. If you have any further discussion that you want to talk about, especially I know the idea of sexuality is complex, and I certainly have not covered all of what this novel has to say, or even the issue in general, please include your comments down below. And I'd also love to hear what you think about my analysis of her boredom as relevant to the form that Margaret Atwood chose to express that idea. So, or any other topics that you think I've missed and you'd like to discuss, share them down below. I'd love to engage with you guys in a conversation. And until next time, I'm still a bibliophile.